All right, we're going right now. All right,
Okay, got it.
perfect. I don't know why it always gives me problems. Let's see.
Wayne, do the intro.
All right, I said I'm not doing the intro, Manny. Don't tell me what to do.
Well, God damn it! Would you introduce the guest? Go ahead.
Hold on and make sure we're on.
All right.
Stop being so demanding. All right, I think we're on. All right, no intro this week. Welcome to Red Cell Review. Today, we are joined once again by Brian Johnson's best friend, Jesse Fink. Welcome, Jesse. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Jesse. So, I wanted to start out real quick before we get started about your professional background, because you didn't start out as a rock journalist or consider yourself a rock journalist. Would that be correct?
No, not at all. And I actually, after writing those two books on ACDC, I didn't want to sort of be pigeonholed as a rock writer.
Right.
So that's why I deliberately went and sort of did a book on cocaine trafficking, and now I've just written a book about a spy. So I always try to do sort of different things and just not be pigeonholed. So I think I was in danger of that happening to me after those books. Just to be seen as the ACDC writer. So I've kind of stepped away from ACDC very deliberately.
And the reason I asked that question is I want listeners to know that you are not a rock writer per se, that your background is in journalism. And
Yeah,
so that's why I brought that up. I wanted people to know that your background was in journalism, that you're not a rock journalist per se. You're a journalist, excuse me.
yeah. I actually started my career as a book editor for HarperCollins, and worked for about 5 years on sort of biographies and sports books, and I would do gardening books, you name it. I was just doing nonfiction, and then I kind of moved over into sports journalism. I was a deputy editor of like the Australian version of Sports Illustrated for a few years, and while I was in that job, I went off to Germany on a junket that was paid for by the German government, and wrote a story about the Confederations Cup, which is the um, tournament that precedes the World Cup, and I ended up sort of becoming a football columnist online. This was back in around sort of 2006, so quite a long time ago.
And when you say football, do you mean Australian football or you mean what the Americans would call soccer?
Soccer, yeah. So
Okay.
so I
He
became
means what the whole rest of the world knows as football, except in our weird.
I
right,
just
Jesse?
wanted it explained for our American audiences because there is Aussie rules football. So I
yeah,
have family in Melbourne, so they remind me.
right, okay. Yeah, so I was a soccer writer, and I worked online, writing blogs every day. Did that for 5 years. Um, Wrote a book. My first book was about Australian soccer, and then after my sports writing career came to an end, I wrote a book about my second marriage. Sorry, my first marriage. It was my second book. Um, and then I started writing about relationships and sex, and then I sort of fell into writing about ACDC. That's just how it happened. So it wasn't like a plan to write about rock or anything like that. It was just how it worked out. And then suddenly I found myself spending 7 years writing about ACDC.
When you wrote the Bon Scott book, and the reason I'm asked this is because of Brian Johnson's comments that you want to respond to. You didn't have any agenda. Your whole purpose of the book wasn't to prove that Brian wrote or didn't write Back in Black. You simply were to tell a story of Bon Scott, and this is a byproduct of that. Would that be accurate?
Absolutely accurate. I mean, the thing is, like the first book, I should explain, like that, so I've written 2 books. One's The Youngs, The Brothers Who Built AC/DC, which was published in 2014 in the United States. I wrote Bon, The Last Highway as a follow-up. That was published in 2017. And when I wrote the first book, literally it was a case of having gone through this terrible kind of divorce from my wife, who was the mother of my daughter, and losing my family. My life was fucked up. I was at a real low point. And it was literally a case of like me wanting to top myself one night and just happening to put on some AC/DC, and AC/DC's kind of music lifting me up at that particular moment and kind of, in my eyes, saving my life that night. So I went to my publisher and I said, I want to write a book about how fucking great AC/DC's music is and how it's the world's best antidepressant. Right? What is the secret of sort of AC/DC's connection with tens of millions of people around the world? That's what the book was about. It was a tribute to AC/DC, and there was no design when I first started doing these books about me taking down AC/DC. It was just simply a case of I started writing about the trajectory of AC/DC as a business. When they first started in America and then sort of becoming this sort of global marketing colossus that they are. Of course, there was a business story behind it, and you start gathering all your interviews. You start speaking to the people at Atlantic Records, the merchandising people, the tour managers, the managers, the engineers, the producers, anyone who's sort of connected to the band, and then start putting this story together. Then they start telling their story about how this band is, very hard-nosed, very tough in business, all that sort of thing. They're telling me the story. I'm just, putting it down on paper and telling readers what other people are telling me, right? But of course, after you've assembled all this information, you can't help but sort of take a view on the subject that to some other people might be negative. So what I'm trying to say is I didn't go out there and sort of think, fuck these guys, I'm going to take down AC/DC.
Right.
I simply kind of just recorded what other people were telling me, and then formed my own opinion about the subject based on what they were telling me. Right. And then I thought, well, okay, there's something a little bit, not right around the whole sort of story of, like the lyrics to Back in Black. And I was always wondering, why don't people sort of explore this sort of issue a little bit more forensically? Why is it sort of just sort of brushed over and not sort of dealt with sort of journalistically? And so when, The Youngs was a success and my publisher was interested in a follow-up to the book, and sort of Bon came up as a subject, I thought, well, the 2 major issues around the life of Bon Scott are, how did he die? Was heroin involved? And did he have anything to do with Back in Black? And they're the 2 sort of major issues, I think, that like Clinton Walker, for instance, who wrote the first biography of Bon Scott, he didn't really get into those to a great degree in his biography of Bon. And I thought, so that was an opportunity for me to really get stuck in and kind of address this issue that so many journalists, just sort of don't cover or just won't go there. And you got to ask, why don't they do it?
Right.
What are they afraid of? I think with a lot of the media in America, particularly, so many of the people who are sort of have the positions of power in the American media, the people like Eddie Trunk and so on.
Sorry, had to throw that out there.
Yeah, Eddie Trunk. Anyway, go ahead.
So on. They have personal connections to these people, right? So they don't want to get into it. They don't want to sort of upset people, or it's about sort of not wanting to upset the record company, or sort of pre-existing personal relationships. All these sort of things that go into kind of stopping people from looking into issues that the fans are actually really interested in. And the good thing about me, getting back to Manny's original question about, my journalistic background and not being a rock writer, was that I was completely independent of all that. Mm-hmm. I didn't have an agenda. There was nothing at all stopping me from sort of exploring, these issues in an investigative way, like a detective. So that's what I did, and I actually found the process really bloody enjoyable. But difficult.
And you've been ruffling some feathers, especially of late with Brian Johnson. Manny mentioned before, he just released his book, and then he did an interview with Rolling Stone. And he didn't mention your name, but he did say a particular journalist, a writer in Australia, which obviously is you.
Is obviously you, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and then implied they did not have the internet in Australia, which is one of the weirdest fucking things I've ever read in a recent magazine interview.
Australia does have internet.
I had a guy have a crack at me the other day saying, it wasn't about you. I certainly took it as me. I think, irrespective of who Brian Johnson is talking about, and I've got to pay credit. There have been other people over the years who have certainly raised questions about the lyrics on Back in Black,
right?
And I talk about them in the book. I think the most important thing here is just to sort of address kind of what he said,
right?
And respond to it. And I get really frustrated, like when sites like Ultimate Classic Rock, for instance, or Blabbermouth or whatever, will run a story sort of saying Brian Johnson shoots down Back in Black rumors, right? And just basically report what he said, and then not report the counter argument. Like I went and wrote a blog the other day, sort of basically pointing out why I think Brian Johnson is
right. I was going to bring all that up too, because you do bring up a lot of good points.
Have the receipts,
right?
Yeah, exactly, but that's not reported by these aggregator sites, right?
Right.
Of course not, because it doesn't speak to their narrative.
To their narrative, but also don't piss off the record company, don't piss off AC/DC. Let's just kind of sweep it under the carpet, and continue on our merry way. And the thing is, fans will only find the the journalism that I've done on this subject in my books, because it's not being published in magazines. What the fuck is Rolling Stone doing?
Right.
Well,
so I literally wrote to the writer of the interview with Brian Johnson in Rolling Stone. I wrote to him on LinkedIn, and I said, here's my response to Brian Johnson. I think you've either mentioned me. I certainly took it that you've mentioned me in this story. I think I should have right of reply here. So I wrote to him and just said, here's my response. Nothing. Crickets.
Really?
So what the fuck are they doing?
Right.
Well, it's not like Rolling Stone has any integrity whatsoever, but
Rolling Stone never liked AC/DC till about,
yeah,
what, 20 or 30 years ago after the fact. And another thing, Jesse, you're not saying Brian wrote all the lyrics. You're pointing out to specific songs on the album. You Shook Me All Night Long was one. Um, was Hell's Bells or Back in Black the other one you referred to? There was a couple, I believe, Jesse, but you weren't saying he wrote the whole thing, but you're saying that he wrote some of the melodies and the lyrics.
Sorry. Yeah, go on.
No, I'm just saying from your research, for example, but you're not the only writer to write about AC/DC, but you're the only writer to have talked to Bond's American friends. Mick Wall, as far as I know, did not in his book. And Malcolm Dome wrote one of those quick books in the 80s, that, came and went. And Clinton Walker certainly did not talk to, I believe, other than Silver Smith, he didn't talk to anybody from Bond's background in the United States, from what I can tell from reading his book.
I could say without a shadow of a doubt that I've certainly, investigated. Sorry, I've certainly looked into this issue more than any other writer, and yes, I've gone and spoken to hundreds of people over the course of 2 books about this particular issue, and I good friends with Bond's ex-girlfriend Holly, who's in Miami, and I had someone sort of have a crack at me this week, sort of saying, oh, you didn't put her surname in the book, you didn't use a real name. It's like, well, honestly, do you think I've made it all up?
Well, Bob Woodward didn't use the real name of anybody when he wrote his book on Richard Nixon. So come on.
Yeah. Of course, if I go down to Miami and a girl is sort of saying, yes, I slept with Bon Scott and he was my boyfriend and whatever, you think I'm going to corroborate it? Of course I'm going to corroborate it. That's why I spoke to half a dozen people in Miami. Was she with Bon Scott? Yes, she was. We went to her party out at Key Biscayne. Okay. So if six people are saying they were together, well, then they were together. Just because photographs don't exist of them sort of hanging out with in Miami doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
So, people are, I think they just sort of, I get frustrated because a lot of people also aren't very clear about what their own sort of personal connections are to people, in AC/DC or in AC/DC or around sort of AC/DC, like the Bon Scott estate and so on. So a lot of people are quite duplicitous, I think, and not very clear about, what their personal relationships are to these people. So I have so many people who want to take me down all the time. It's not just sort of like online abuse. I mean, these people are sort of actively trying to just discredit me and sort of making out as if I'm like this sort of avaricious fantasist who's only done this because I just want to make money, that I'm sort of, doing it for sort of mercenary reasons, which is completely fucking ridiculous. If anything, I've lost money working on these books.
Yeah.
I could have made more money stacking shelves in the supermarket than I have made in royalties from these books, right? As anyone in a creative industry knows, most of your royalties don't get to you. They get sort of absorbed into costs and printing costs and everything else.
Everybody else makes money but you.
Everyone else makes money but you. That's just the way that these creative businesses are. I've got to say, my AC/DC books have made money, but it doesn't all end up in my pocket. The publisher takes their money and the agents take their money, and the sub agents take their money, and miraculously somehow at the end of all that, a few $100 might end up in your pocket. But it's not like I'm sort of making millions of dollars from these
Right.
books.
Lou, I think you
Even
have
if you
something to
were,
say.
there's nothing wrong with that, so.
Lou, you have something?
Yeah, 2 points. One, the events of the time up to Bon Scott's passing were definitely corroborated in Pete Way of UFO and Wasted's autobiography, Fast Ride Out of Here. So if anyone has any questions to the legitimacy of what you wrote in your book, there is a second book out there that references that. So
Yeah, and I spoke to Pete Way before he died for the book, as well as Paul Chapman. Who were both neglected by Clinton Walker. Clinton Walker, released a supposedly sort of updated version of his book in 2015 and just completely ignored Pete Way and Paul Chapman.
Wasn't Clinton Walker's take that they were both junkies, so they were unreliable? Wasn't that his take on it?
Everyone was a junkie back then, though, for God's sakes.
Essentially, that's what he said. But Christ, everyone in rock music in the late 70s, early 80s was on something. It's ridiculous.
The second point I was going to make is that for anyone to take umbrage with anything that you've written in your books, really needs to go to the source material, and that's they should take umbrage with the people that you interviewed, because they're obviously the ones that were affected the most by Bon's passing or what was going on at the time. I know you've referenced Doug Thaler, a former manager of AC/DC, and to Doug's credit, he stated some things that the entity known as AC/DC tries to shut down, but all you did was just print everything from his perspective. That's not you going out and attacking the band. It's completely two different things. If any, and in your defense, I'm going to say this: if anyone has umbrage with something that a reputable journalist has to put in their book, remember, he's not the source material. He's just a storyteller. Take it up with the people who were there at the time that provided him that information. And this is not blue journalism.
Exactly. That's the point I was trying to make before, is that you research, you assemble all these quotes and sort of put them in your book, and eventually when you're going over the massive kind of interviews that you have done, you as a journalist or a historian working on this book, you are entitled to make a judgment based on the information that you've gathered. Right? That's your job. You're a professional writer. I'm an intelligent person. I can sort of review all the information that I've assembled and kind of make a judgment based on that material. And the judgment that I came to is reflected in those books. But it's based on hundreds and hundreds of interviews with people who worked closely with the band, right? So it's not like I've just sort of made it all up. It's those two books are the product of 7 years' work.
I've read both books, and actually, they're not an attack. If anything, the first book, The Youngs, for example, my take. It's an excellent book, by the way. It was a history of Australian music industry through and using not Angus Young per se, using a Young family, George Young, Angus, Harry Vanda, is that how you say his name?
Yeah.
Albert Productions. To me, it was a history of Australia, which I found fascinating, because I think in your book you point out how in Australia you guys would not get whatever the music trends were happening from somewhere else to way after. So I thought it was interesting, and how AC/DC, not just the Bon Scott era, at the point your Young book was about the business side of it. It also was a tribute to the music, in my opinion. There's never at any point in time in the book that you were harsh toward the Youngs or Bon Scott, or even Brian Johnson, truthfully. As a matter of fact, if anything, these things you say about Malcolm Young aren't things that you have just said. Mick Wall, Malcolm Dome, Clinton Walker, the band themselves have said how hard-nosed Malcolm Young was, and how hard he could be. Brian Johnson has said that himself. It's not just you. The point I'm saying is, I don't want to make it seem like the books are some negative take on the band. They're not. They're actually it's like it's a journalistic view of the history of the industry through the Young's eyes in the first book. And the Bon Scott book was almost a history of the 70s rock using AC/DC in a way. Because
Yes.
as you point out, almost the minute Bon Scott dies, has nothing to do with Bon's death. The industry literally changes in 1980. MTV a year later, the way the record contracts are printed out, the way touring is done. You read your Bon Scott book, and it seems so primitive compared to the way bands tour, including AC/DC today. And I apologize, I'm dominating this conversation,
No, it's
guys.
fine. Go ahead. Nope.
But
I thought,
I just think that people who are just reading the what people are pulling out of the book are reading some things out of context.
Or they're
They
reading
have
the
to
smear campaigns that they're posting on social media.
well, like you shook me all night long, like your take on that, for example. The horse's name was Double Time. The way Bon Scott spoke to women, especially Holly X about her eyes. Those things on there, but they're taken out of context and it's going, well, Brian Johnson had nothing to do with Back in Black. You've never said that. You're pointing out on certain sections. So that's what I wanted to point out. You never said Brian Johnson did not contribute to the contribution of Back in Black or didn't have anything to do with the writing. You're pointing out certain aspects of Back in Black that maybe Bon Scott should have been credited for. That's what I wanted to bring out.
you made some very good points there. Number one, that the Youngs was really a tribute to Australian rock. The Australian rock sound. That was what I was trying to write about. Bond the Last Highway was a tribute to that era in American rock of the big arena shows and the festivals and that period that will never be repeated. It was. I did it with a great deal of affection. I wrote those books with a great deal of affection for those two subjects, and of course, in the first book, it was about the rise of AC/DC as a band, and the second book was about sort of how AC/DC broke in America. That's essentially what those two books were about. So I haven't set out, as I said before, to sort of assassinate anyone. It was done with a great deal of kind of respect and affection. I've been super kind of careful about being respectful of the band every time that I've ever done an interview. Certainly about what I put in print in a book. I've got to also be careful that I don't defame anyone. Because at the end of the day, I'll be the person being sued. So I don't have any kind of personal beef with any of these people. Certainly, with Brian Johnson, I have no personal beef with Brian Johnson. I seem to think that, how people talk about me and me wanting to kind of, smear Brian Johnson, and I see it all the time on social media. It's just ridiculous. Honestly, it's just crazy. As you say, the only thing that I do is present, compelling information, things that people have said, inconsistencies in the story or whatever, and then just sort of raise those questions. It's not a conspiracy theory. I think even Brian Johnson in the book calls all this shit a conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. All it is me and to a lesser degree other writers over the years having pointed out that, over the past 4 decades, certain things have been said about Back in Black that are highly inconsistent, right? Such as, Bond wrote a little of the stuff, coming out of the mouth of Angus Young. And then in subsequent interviews, he wrote nothing. Okay, so what's the story?
Yeah, as latest as 1998, I think it was a Rolling Stone interview, an Australian Rolling Stone interview. And, and Angus admitted that, they wanted to start the album because Bond did write some of the songs and it was going to be a tribute to Bond. So
yeah, but even putting aside, whether Bond had actually written anything, I mean, there are even inconsistent sort of quotes about how much they had done.
Right.
Musically, there's all sorts of sort of inconsistencies in the story around the lyrics of Back in Black, and then you have the separate issue of does the Bon Scott estate get royalties?
Right.
Excuse me for 1 second, guys. I gotta go. I got something work related I gotta take care of. Sorry.
All right.
All right, Greg.
We'll be here. Just come back.
Yep.
This whole thing around the royalties, which was mentioned by Vince Lovegrove, and people watching this should know that Vince Lovegrove was a very good friend of Bon Scott, who was in the band The Valentines with Bon. Vince Lovegrove was certainly, I think, of the view that Bon had something to do with the lyrics to Back in Black, and he wrote on his personal blog just before his death. This is Vince I'm talking about. He died in a car crash. That he was told by one of Bond's brothers that the family got royalties for Back in Black. Okay, well, what's the truth? Why is Back in Black on the Bondfest tribute album?
Yeah, the bonfire thing. Yeah, I never ever thought of that until I read your thing the other day about that. That is kind of weird, even though I kind of understand, because a tribute album to Bond, and that's all the Bond stuff. But
it's like, why repackage an album that's been already released?
Right.
No, not only that, sold like what worldwide 35 million or something like that. Ridiculous number.
So if you think about it, right? If Bond's family is getting royalties from Back in Black, it's a significant amount of money, right? And the point I make in the first book about the Youngs, and certainly the way that they've treated various band members of AC/DC over the years, look at Phil Rudd, look at Chris Slade, look at Mark Evans, look at Tony Correnti, look at the way that
Brian Johnson.
Recently Brian Johnson. Look at the way that they've been treated, right? Why would they be making this extraordinary exception for Bon Scott? Right? You've got to remember, at the end of 1979, Bon Scott was completely off the rails. Right? He was high as a kite on drugs. You just look at photographs of him, between 1977 to 1979 to see the physical deterioration of Bon Scott. And so by the early months of 1980, with some of those last photographs of Bon, he looked absolutely strung out and fucking wasted, right? So his life was in a pretty sort of dark state, and the shows were suffering. He had always had a separate sort of life to the band. You know, he certainly turned up and did the shows and whatever, and did whatever he needed to do, and then he sort of went off. He wasn't hanging out with the band sort of after shows and spending days with them. He was off with his various girlfriends in various cities around the United States. And that's how he lived. That's what Pete Way told me. You know, he had the same sort of lifestyle. So
we know.
this idea that Youngs and Bond were like super close, I just don't think is true.
I was trying to find somebody posted a picture of Bon Scott.
Like Blackfoot, the Southern rock band Blackfoot, and the band Y&T, when they toured with AC/DC, both mentioned that Bond would hang out at the tour bus. So, and that is independent of anything you reported, because I don't, so Dave said that. Yeah,
one of the,
Dave said that.
I can't remember who told me. One of the guys, I think from Yesterday and Today, told me the same story.
Y&T, yeah, that's them. Yeah.
For Bond the Last Highway, he said that the Bond didn't want to take the AC/DC tour bus, that he got on their bus. So he had a separate life from the band. So this idea that it was like a band of brothers, and this whole sort of story about the band not being able to go on without Bon Scott, I just don't believe. I don't believe at all. I just think it's just a narrative that has been sort of constructed over the years. It has had various sort of layers of untruths added to it, and it's sort of just become this fantasy, / mythology that fans and the media have sort of subscribed to, and all sort of basis of reality has sort of been lost. And so, my job was kind of looking at those myths and sort of, deconstructing them and sort of finding out what the truth actually was.
Well, Jesse, I'm one of those guys that want to believe these myths, because I wanted to believe they were a band of brothers when I was a kid, because Bon Scott was my first rock hero, truthfully. I still love the guy. So yeah, I was one of those guys that wanted to believe that, but I was a kid. I didn't know jack shit about the business or what a name is worth or anything like that whatsoever. And I'll go back to my question, but Lou, it sounds like you wanted to say something.
Well, I'm thinking that the Scott family probably wanted some kind of restitution for whatever Bond was dealing with, because the fact that he seemed strung out, and the fact that he was unhappy, especially with that final tour, and he kind of voiced that he wanted to leave. If there's one thing I've learned, and I'm a complete outsider in the music industry, I'm happy to say 20 years of musician, never signed. And I've seen what happened to friends of mine that did get signed. There's this availability of every possible indulgence that you can have. And rather than warn you about it, it's kind of enabled. Like, for example, Lear Cohen, I actually posted a short about him where he's talking about how he signs rappers who talk about their drug use, and a lot of times those rappers end up dying because of that drug use, never thinking about, is this going to negatively affect their community that they come from? No, it's all to make a buck. As much as we're grateful that the music industry has given us some of the titans like AC/DC, like Iron Maiden, like Black Sabbath, like Def Leppard, in those bands have emerged stories of some of the toxicities that the music industry is, notorious for exacerbating. So, it's a really sad thing. And I would tell
Larry is back now.
Well, but
You're frozen. Sorry.
Look at Phil Rudd's face.
Did anything I say come through?
Most of it.
Every day.
Okay, thanks.
Look at Phil Rudd's face, right?
Mm.
He was this incredibly handsome man at one point, and now, look at Phil Rudd. He hasn't aged well. You know, that's a life in rock and roll for you.
Yeah. I've got a question for you, Jesse. Mutt Lange has never gone on the record about the making of either Highway to Hell or Back in Black or practically anything else. Do you have any insight why he does not talk about any of that at all?
He's
I'm
just
sure you
private in
tried
general.
talking to him. Yeah. I mean, do you have any insight in that at all?
Look, all I can say is I did my utmost to connect with Mutt Lange, or Langer, however you want to say it,
Yeah.
as much as I could, and I actually managed to get a couple of emails sent to him. But my friend who was passing the emails on sort of got back to me and said, look, he just doesn't want to comment on anything publicly, so won't be involved. Look, I think it probably suits Mutt Lange to some degree to be private the way he is. Sort of just adds to his mystique. You know, the less you say, the more people are fascinated by you. And it probably adds a few zeros to his, you know, contract.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
it's the same. It's the same sort of thing that, you know, football coaches do. You know, the less that you talk, the more people are fascinated by you, and the more that they want you to work for them. So I don't know. There are just some people who are quite happy to talk, and then there are others who, you know, choose.
Wayne, anything in the chat you want to bring up?
Well, I just want to say thanks for joining the chat. There's a lot of people in here actually right now. Pink Summers, Andrew Peters, BP, James Karen, and I think there was somebody else named, but I can't find them now. But anyway, earlier on, Pink Summers asked a question. I gotta find it here. Okay. If she's not mistaken, Doug Thaler believed that Bon Scott wrote "You Shook Me All Night Long." Was he not their manager from 1977 to 1979?
He was their tour manager of their North American tours. And I met Doug in New York when I was writing The Youngs. And we stayed in touch. And you know, that guy was like super close to AC/DC. You know, he knew George Young. He knew the whole AC/DC apparatus very intimately. So I think it was pretty telling that, you know, someone who was as connected as Doug Thaler was to AC/DC. And remember, Doug Thaler, he was in a band with Ronnie James Dio. He sort of managed Bon Jovi, I think, and Motley Crue at one point. He's a very connected guy.
Yeah, he did manage those guys in the 80s. You're right. And he was an Elf with Dio. Wow.
That's right. And so that's where he met George Young, because the Easy Beats came to America. Elf did some shows with the Easy Beats, and that's how sort of Doug Thaler got the job with AC/DC. It was through his connection to George Young. So Doug Thaler's coming to me and saying, you know, you can bet your life that Bon wrote "You Shook Me All Night Long," and Doug was actually having phone calls from Bon Scott just before Bon died. So he spoke to Bon on the phone. He knew what Bon's mental state was, right? He knew the guy. You know, why is he telling me these things if you know, there's not some sort of substance to it? You know, and then you've got David Krebs. David Krebs was the head of Lieber Krebs, the management company that signed AC/DC. AC/DC dumped Michael Browning and went with Lieber Krebs. Suddenly AC/DC's on these sort of, you know, big festival shows. You know, that's really when their career took off. You know, Lieber Krebs is mentioned actually on the back of Back in Black. It's actually printed on the cover of Back in Black. right? So David still gets a cut of royalties for Back in Black because he was their manager at one point. You know, David Krebs is coming to me and saying, oh, look, you know, I wasn't involved in this decision to, you know, write the credits the way that they were written for Back in Black. But I think, you know, Bon had something to do with the Back in Black. This is the fucking manager of AC/DC, right? That's pretty fucking significant, pretty compelling.
Yeah, you would think.
Yeah. So, you know, why aren't more people like the Rolling Stones of the world sort of paying attention to this? We're talking about, you know, what is regarded, whether it's completely true or not, the second biggest selling album of all time.
Right.
Right? It's a big fucking story. But who's fucking writing about it? In the American press? No one.
No one.
Who's doing podcasts about it apart from you guys? Are the Eddie Trunks of the world doing podcasts about it?
No, he's too busy
Is
talking about
Howard
UFO.
Stern doing a podcast about it?
Eddie
But,
Trunk's too busy talking about White Lion 35 years later. Anyways, Greg, did you have any question for Jesse?
Not really. I'm pretty goddamn pissed off about work. I kind of forgot pretty much everything I was gonna say. Honestly, sorry about.
We have to go back in the chat and look.
No, but it's interesting you're wearing a UFO t-shirt.
But there is an interesting thing, like you always bring up, is how, you know,
one thing I did want to mention, and I was figuring maybe Jesse might know more about this since he did the research for the books, but I could swear it was in a major magazine or something. And at first I was thinking it was Malcolm, but now it might have been Angus. But I could swear, Jesse, that one of the brothers said in print somewhere, straight out even said, there was a rough demo recording of Hell's Bells that they had done with Bon. It wasn't a finished song, but I remember specifically them mentioning Hell's Bells, and I think maybe You Shook Me All Night Long.
Yes. You know, look, I've heard so many stories over the years about, you know, demos existing and people having said that, you know, that they got a cassette tape in the mid 80s of some, you know, some rough demo of, you know, Bon Scott singing a couple of these songs, but nothing has ever materialized. And what's amazing is that there are, I think, you know, a couple of recordings on YouTube that people are convinced is Bon Scott singing You Shook Me All Night Long, but it's not. I can say that. It's not.
No, and by demo, I didn't mean something recorded. I meant more like they were demoing it for each other, like having a rehearsal session, not necessarily that they were making a tape.
Okay, but you raise an interesting point, right? Which is that, you know, the way that sort of AC/DC worked was that, you know, Bon would be sort of writing lyrics over a long period of time. The Youngs would be kind of working on their riffs and the music, you know, and songs would sort of take shape over months and months and months. And this is sort of what happened with, you know, Power Age, Highway to Hell, and then you get to Back in Black, and the current conventional story is that, you know, Bon was about to turn up to the recording studio having nothing prepared, right?
Yeah.
That's fucking bullshit, right? Absolute fucking bullshit. So, you know, I spoke to Silver Smith. Silver was, you know, Bon's muse. She basically was, you know, the inspiration for most of the songs on Power Age. So, you know, we could all thank, you know, Silver for that. Before she died, she said that Bon called her on the night, the evening before he died, and said, I've finished writing all the songs for the album. Let's go out and celebrate. Right? And that's why he called her. He said, "Let's go out. I want to hit the town because I've finished doing the writing." And she told me, and other people have told me, that basically his writing process was that he would go away for a week or two or a month or whatever and just work on his lyrics. And then by the time that he turned up to the recording studio, basically he had it all ready, you know? But then now the story is, oh, Bon, come down to the studio. We're ready to see you. We've done all the music. And now you can start writing lyrics. No, that's just not the way it worked. That's not what he did. Anyone who knew him will tell you he had a notebook. He had these exercise pads. They were legal pads that he was working and scribbling lyrics on. And he would walk around with these notepads or these exercise books. And they were always in his possession. All his girlfriends told me that that's what he walked around with. He had his exercise pads. He had his comb, and he was quite a neat person. He was a very organized person, but he never not had his notebook on him. And where is the fucking notebook?
I say, when I remember reading in the book that it just did everything, all that stuff just disappeared after he passed away.
Yeah, so Ian Jeffrey, who was, very close to the band, a tour manager of AC/DC, he spoke to me for the Youngs, and he was very vague about it. He still was, quite sort of upset, I think, about how he had been sort of sacked by the band, and unhappy about how everything had gone down. But Ian Jeffrey was the guy who we're led to believe basically went into the flat after Bond's flat after he had died, and on the request of management. And Ian Jeffrey, and this has sort of been this rumor, and hasn't been confirmed by Ian Jeffrey at all, that he actually is in possession of, I think it's about 15 sheafs of paper of Bond's lyrics, and Ian. People can read the Youngs and sort of read what he says, but he basically says, a little bit of Bond's writing is on Back in Black, and then he gets all vague and says, well, maybe not. So I think he didn't want to piss anyone off.
Right.
He didn't want to upset anyone in AC/DC. He obviously still has a lot of affection for them, and he probably wants to sort of, reconnect with them. So he's not looking to kind of step on anyone's toes. But I'll just say that the other thing that you have to kind of also remember was that Bon Scott was actually working on some lyrics for a French band called Trust, who had recorded an album in French, and then they were going to do an album in English, and he was helping those guys out with their songs and sort of what's the best word, translating them into English.
Mm-hmm.
And he was doing that around the same time. So either Ian Jeffrey possibly came into possession of some of Bond's lyrics for AC/DC, or possibly, Bond's lyrics for Trust. Who knows? It's all very vague. But he essentially said, Bond had some things written.
In case anyone doesn't know,
Go ahead.
I was saying, in case anyone doesn't know who Trust is, they're the band that wrote Antisocial that Anthrax covered and made a hit in the United States. But there's two things that I want to mention from the chat. Greg, the magazine that you were referencing was James Caron believes that it was Kerrang that quote was taken from. And also, James Caron also said, "You'll never get anything out of Mutt Lange. In the world of speedboats, he's a submarine."
Fair enough.
Well, you blew your chance with Shania Twain, Mutt. So, oh well.
Right.
Sorry, Manny. Go ahead.
Jesse, it was part of your suspicion, or not? Because again, you weren't out with an agenda to whether Brian wrote or didn't write, because you're writing a biography of Bon Scott. Was part of it because prior to AC/DC, in Geordie, Brian only had, I think, 4 or 5 writing credits. I have the albums. I'm not at my house, so I go grab them. The Geordie albums, and in Back in Black,
Listen to
he
him
is
every
a
day.
lyric writer to every song. Some, again, like, I like giving the dog a bone, but I am damn sure Bond did not write that. It's so ridiculous. But anyway, was that part of a question you felt should be asked? Because Brian wasn't known as a
Yeah,
lyric writer prior to Back in
yeah,
Black. I think, yeah, I mean, he wrote, maybe 6 songs, maybe. I don't have the albums in front of me.
yeah. It's about half a dozen or less than half a dozen. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I list them in the book, and they were all completely forgettable sort of Geordie songs that he had co-written, I think, with the band's guitarist.
Yeah, Vic Malcolm, yeah.
That's right. And so really he didn't have any kind of pedigree really in songwriting before he got the AC/DC job. And there's a guy on Bon Scott Forum on Facebook, which is this group that I run with a bunch of people. A guy called Larry Black, who made a point the other day. He said, are we led to believe that, AC/DC, the entire sort of AC/DC kind of apparatus, which, is a very big apparatus, that they decided that they would fly, 7,000 kilometers to the Bahamas, book a hotel at, Compass Point, book the studio, haul all their sort of gear and everything else out to the Caribbean, and sort of, ask Brian, a couple of days before they sort of press record, on this new album. Oh, by the way, can you write lyrics? How does that work? I mean, honestly, you don't know whether he can write lyrics or not. You've just hired the guy to write songs for your new album, and you just sort of happen to ask him at the last minute, oh, by the way, can you write lyrics?
It is rather sus.
And he hasn't been able to write anything as good since, like you've mentioned.
Well,
Too.
yeah.
Yeah,
What are you
supposedly
talking about? A walk in the park?
Right.
Don't reference that again, Manny.
And supposedly this perfect rock song, which is "You Shook Me All Night Long," which I think anyone who's fair will say, yeah, that sounds like a Bon Scott song. Supposedly Brian Johnson miraculously wrote this in 15 minutes with the help of the ghost of Bon Scott, right? This is a guy who only had 6 co-writing credits on a bunch of shitty Geordie songs, suddenly comes up with you Shook Me All Night Long. I just don't believe it.
Nah, I smoked a lot of PCP too. That doesn't sound right.
Plus the melody is, not just the lyrics, but melody wise.
Right. They're very
And again, I'm not trying to
It's,
take, I am a Brian Johnson fan, but melody wise, it sounds like a Bond tune, She was a fast machine. Bond loved American women. I mean, that's, American thighs. That's totally Mr. Scott right there.
Okay, so that's a good point. So okay, let's start with the hypothesis that Bon Scott wrote "You Shook Me All Night Long." Okay, well, let's go back and look at, the songs on Highway to Hell and Power Age. What are they about? Oh, they're about Bond's life. They're about women that he knew. They're about his financial struggles or whatever, or getting rejected in a bar, or some woman that he's met. Right? They're all about his life. Right? He wrote songs from his life. That's what people connect with. That's why those songs still resonate with people, because there's some sort of personal element to them. That's what later periods of AC/DC songs don't have. They're just complete shit, right? Because there's no heart in them. There's no personal story behind them.
Right.
The reason why Bond songs are so great was that he's putting himself in the songs, and we connect with them. And so if you start with the hypothesis that Bond wrote you Shook Me All Night Long, okay, well then let's look at the lyrics. Look at the verse about American thighs. There's the line, what is it?
I really not the American thighs line. That one as well, but made a meal out of me and then come back for more. That's totally something Bond would write. I mean, 100%.
So she kept her motor clean, right? Okay, that's the first line, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
She was a
machine, motor clean. Yeah.
Second line, right? Okay, so I went to one of Bond's girlfriends. He had another girlfriend in Miami called Patty Bishop. There was this hot blonde chick in Miami, and she said, "He's talking about vaginas, right?"
Yeah, of course.
Of course.
He loves women with clean pussies, right? Yep. There's nothing he couldn't.
My virgin ears.
I mean, we've all heard Crab City in Blue. I can understand why. You don't want to be sideways walking.
You can put that quote in your your trailer, Wayne. That's highlighted.
By the way,
okay. So she kept her motor clean, right? So let's go with the idea that it's about a clean vagina, right?
An ode to summer's eve.
She tells me this story about another woman that Bond had sort of been involved with, who had this stinky vagina, and how he this is true, right?
No.
Anyone who's offended out there by biology, shut up. That's all I'm going to say.
And that he dumped this woman basically because he couldn't stand her stinky vagina. Right?
This is so Bond, Scott. It's great.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like she kept the motor clean. Now suddenly I'm looking at that line. It's like, yeah, now it fucking makes sense. Right? It makes sense. And then you marry that with American Thighs and Double Time and all the other things that that I wrote about in Bond: The Last Highway. And I'm down in Miami with Holly X, and she's standing in front of me, and I'm seeing photographs of her from 1979 in Miami when she was with Bond. And she's got a horse called Double Time. It's like shit. Now I can see Bond writing this song because all the I'm starting to join all the dots here, and I'm not going out and I'm not saying in the book that this is, the truth. I'm just saying it's pretty fucking compelling that if You Shook Me All Night Long is a Bon Scott song, then I think this is a pretty compelling kind of explanation for the lyrics, certainly to that verse. And she says to me, you know, that she went out to the Newport Hotel in Miami, and that Bond turned to her and said, you know, you have chartreuse eyes. And then I'm looking at the line "sightless eyes" in the song, and I'm thinking, what the fuck does sightless eyes mean?
The blind chick. No, we don't know.
She's blind, Jesse.
Right. And then I'm thinking, okay, so maybe that could be one of the lines that was edited or played with, you know, that maybe something was changed. And I think if you read, you know, other verses in that song, it doesn't have the same sort of zip and kind of feel of that first verse. Right.
Right.
It's not as well written. I think is it the second verse? It's not as well written as the first verse.
No, it's
Right?
not, you know. She by the way,
I don't have the lyrics in front of me, but like I remember, you know, like reading the lyrics, I'm thinking, okay, that first verse is fucking great. The second one's not so good. Right.
what's his second verse?
So okay, let's go with the idea.
Cool
you know,
me down or take another round or something like that. It's
Oh,
Back
yeah,
in the
yeah,
ring,
it's
take
about-
another swing.
It turns into a boxing ring metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, and you bring up giving the dog a bone. I agree with you. I don't think that is a Bon Scott line. Just don't think it's something that he would have ever.
Yeah,
No,
I
he's too
listened to
clever.
it again this morning, and I was thinking, you know what? I do like the song, but it's not as cleverly written as any song off Powerage, you know. So
Yeah, but also it's sort of smutty and you know, what's the word?
It's grade school.
Misogynistic.
Well-
and Bond was never misogynistic.
No,
You know,
no.
The Youngs were, but Bond wasn't. You know, but the Youngs sort of had that, you know, that sort of ratty little schoolboy sort of feel about them, you know, when it came to women. You know, that they were, you know, and you look at all the sort of songs written by AC/DC, sort of post Bon Scott, that are about women, and they're all fairly crude. You know,
Oh yeah, yeah.
Bond
Cover
wasn't
you in-
Go Down comes to mind.
Bond wasn't crude. I think he you know, yes, he loved fucking women, but he didn't, you know, he didn't sort of diminish them in any way. That they were sort of joyful things, you know, joyful subjects for his songs. There was nothing nasty or crude about his songs about women. And so, you know, giving the dog a bone, it just doesn't. That doesn't
fit his
feel
style.
like Bond to me. at
No,
all.
and he has a very distinct swing and flavor to the way he would write and phrase things, and that just doesn't sound anywhere near it, any part of that song.
Exactly. Unlike "You Shook Me All Night Long," which has Bon Scott all over it.
Mhm.
Right?
And Hell's Bells too, parts of it, certain verses, and then like you were saying, same thing with "You Shook Me All Night Long." You get to the next verse and it's like, yeah, this I
Yeah.
don't know who wrote this, but
Yeah, but like, okay, so and then you look at "Back in Black," the song. You know, people saying, "Oh, you know, it's a tribute to Bond. It's about a memorial to Bond. You know, it's about wearing black." No, you read it in a different way. Let's start with the proposition that it's about money. Okay, then for me, the lyrics start to make sense.
yeah.
And
Forget the
you,
hurt, 'cause
and
I'll
you look
never
at
die. Yeah.
and you look at Bond's life around the time that he would have been writing songs for Back in Black, and what was going on in his life. Suddenly, finally, after fucking years of hard slog on the road in America, he had money in his bank account. And I'm the only journalist in the world who has ever gone and found out how much money Bond had in his bank account. Right? It was $31,000. Right? And this was, and I found that because I had to, you know, pay for a fucking probate, you know, from the Supreme Court here in Sydney. it cost me $100, $200 or whatever to get this certificate, but I got, the proof of how much money he had. Okay. And that was probably from the royalties of Highway to Hell. So he was back in the money, and he was doing a successful follow-up to Highway to Hell. And so this idea that, okay, let's think about it. The last American show that he did was in Ohio in, what was it, October 1979. He dies in February 1980. So how many months is that? That's like 5 months or something.
October to February. That's about 4 to 5 months. Yeah.
4 to 5 months. Okay. Seriously, are we led to believe that he had nothing prepared? No. There's absolutely no chance in the world that Bon Scott didn't have lyrics ready. Of course he was fucking working on lyrics. It's insulting to even suggest otherwise. Anyone with half a brain knows that.
Hey, Jesse, I found a quote from Mick Wall. Mick Wall's book, From AC/DC, Hell Ain't a Bad Place to Be. Malcolm Dome claims that shortly before he died, talking about Bond, showed him his book of lyrics. He had sheets of lyrics that he kept in a file, carried them around. And he'd been showing me some of the ideas he'd been working for Back in Black. Not the song Back in Black, but songs for the next album. There are a couple lines that she told me to come, but I was already there. And he saw it written down. These were lyrics, lines used on Back in Black that Bond wrote but wasn't credited with. To this day, he wasn't sure what happened. Dome also stated, Bond proudly showed me some of the scribbles he'd put down in preparation for the album he felt would define AC/DC and open up new possibilities. And then he said, it's hard to be absolutely accurate from the distance of a quarter century through the haze of alcohol, which they drank. But a few lines stick to him. This Malcolm Dome he's gone now. And Mick Wall wrote this book. And neither one of those men work for AC/DC. And, they don't work with you either. That's independent of you. So.
And Manny and I have interviewed Mick Wall, and he's a very courteous, nice, and reputable guy. So.
Yeah. And he, and again, Mick Wall, like you, was not looking to prove. He was telling a story like you are. And Mick Wall is not saying definite. This is something that was told to him, Malcolm Dome, who he was friends with. And Malcolm Dome was good friends with Pete Way, and Pete Way knew Bon Scott. So that's probably how they met way back in 1979 or 80.
So Malcolm Dome is saying that he saw the line, she told me to come. But
yeah, that's what he said. Yeah.
On Bond's notepad, right?
Yeah.
Silver Smith, who was his girlfriend, told me before she died that was a line that he had used in a letter to one of their friends, I think as far back as 1976. Right? So you've got two people saying that line has a connection to Bon Scott. And then suddenly it materializes in You Shook Me All Night Long, but a song that has nothing to do with. It just doesn't stand up. And you mentioned, Mick Wall. Credit to Mick Wall he wrote a book back in, I think it was 2012, about AC/DC, where he really did go into the heroin thing.
He's the only one besides you.
And, well, there was Mark Putterford, and I have to credit Mark Putterford. This was back in what was it, the 90s or something. Mark Putterford died, but he was, I think, the first person to kind of sort of raise the idea that Bonnet had a heroin overdose. And Malcolm Dome also looked into the whole heroin thing as well. Malcolm, I think, said that he died of injecting heroin. So, there's me, Mick Wall, Mark Putterford, Malcolm Dome. There was Vince Lovegrove, who have been looking into these, issues like the lyrics and heroin and so on. It's not all just me. There have been other writers, working on this, and I've certainly, paid credit to those people in the book, and will acknowledge that, because that's what we're here to do as writers. We're kind of that's what any historian does, that you absorb as many sort of sources and utilize as many sort of written interviews and recorded interviews and books and whatever else, and sort of assemble it all together and try to get to the truth. And that's all I try to do with these books. And the more that I look into the whole issue of the Back in Black lyrics issue, the more that I think something just doesn't sit right. It's just not making sense to me, the way that the band put forward the story. And the thing is, all I've ever done in my work is bring up the inconsistencies.
And what I find real interesting about that, I kept trying to say this earlier, but I forgot, to go along with the controversy and Brian's response or whatever. The whole way they try to sensationalize it is ridiculous, and they don't actually put anything you say into the interview or even this bullshit that pops up online. You present facts and inconsistencies and connect the dots, but you don't say, oh, this is the absolute truth, or make a personal attack on Brian. But that's what it's turned into, and absolutely nowhere does that happen. But it's funny that Brian said it's a conspiracy theory, because it looks more like they're trying to form the conspiracy theory to make it quiet.
Well, yes.
The more you know.
Absolutely right. So, he says it's a conspiracy theory and it's fucking bullshit. And then, he gets paid all this money to write this autobiography that's just been released. And you look in the book and you look at what he sort of said about the lyrics issue, the Back in Black. It's like one paragraph, right? It's probably the biggest. It's probably the biggest fucking issue around his entire career, right? It's the elephant in the room. It's been there for 42 years, and you write a book and you only deal with it in one fucking paragraph, right? Come on, we're not stupid. So, I think all he's done by actually even addressing it is sort of I think raise more questions about it.
Yeah.
It's
put it back in the open.
credence.
Gives more credence to, yes, exactly.
And given more attention to it. And the fascinating thing is that when I started on this whole sort of AC/DC book journey back in 2012, 2013 with the Youngs, was that I was going into territory where I wasn't a known quantity, where people, I think, sort of looked at what I did with a good degree of skepticism, and was like, who the fuck are you? And how dare you say these things? How dare you print that? How dare you say that Bond died of a heroin overdose, and so on. And it's been really interesting on a personal level over those years to kind of see the transformation in people's views and opinions about these issues. So it's gone from, you're a complete bullshit artist, Jesse, to I believe you. I am now convinced. And the tenor of a lot of these conversations that I'm seeing online is that, people feel let down from, so to go from, AC/DC is the greatest band in the world, AC/DC fan forever, to I feel really let down. I just want to know the truth. there's been a real switch. And so, like, if we do any sort of poll on Bon Scott Forum about the lyrics to Back in Black, or Bond dying of heroin or anything like that, I would say sort of 85 to 90% of the people who respond to those things are in agreement with my own views. And so that's very satisfying. And it's not like, as you said at the beginning, I'd never set out to take anyone down. All I wanted to do was just raise and ask questions about things that there seem to be a lot of contradictions and inconsistencies, and just get some answers. And the significant thing about what Brian sort of said during the week is that's really the first time since the book came out, since both books came out, that he has ever really addressed that issue. He's done it in a very unsatisfactory way, but it's still the first time that he's done it.
Yeah, so there's got to be something there. Do you think we're ever going to get that answer? You think somebody will eventually spill the beans?
Oh, good question. Phil Rudd? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think Angus Young will, but it's hard to say. I don't think anyone on the management side of things would do it. I don't think Peter Mensch is going to do anything.
Well, Chris Slade has kind of mentioned that he's been slagged by the band on 2 different occasions.
Yeah. But, the feeling I get is, the thing is that people need to understand there are things that are sort of said publicly, and there are things that are said privately. And ne'er the twain shall meet, and
Yeah.
so I hear a lot of things privately that I can't say publicly. Certainly, like what people connected to Bon Scott actually say privately is very different to what they say publicly.
Right.
So that they're, and obviously I can't reveal who they are because I'm betraying a confidence. But there are, a lot of people who obviously have a stake in sort of the mythology of Bon Scott and sort of perpetuating this myth and keeping it going, and it makes money. That's fine. But my interest is as a biographer. I'm not making any money from his books anymore. I mean, that's all stopped. I'm just doing this out of respect for him, as an artist. And I think that if any of Bond's words appear on Back in Black, he should be credited. As a writer, if I had written something and someone else had used it or worked lyrics around what I had written or whatever, or absorbed my words into something, I'd still want credit. It's my work, So if Bond's words appear on Back in Black, as has been suggested by Angus Young, I think people have a right to know.
Yeah,
what's wrong with that? What's
right.
wrong with it?
I don't know. What's the point of taking his name off the album? I mean, just to make Brian Johnson feel better about himself, that he maybe wrote some lyrics on there and he wasn't using any of Bon Scott's. It doesn't make sense, Just
I think
why would anybody care?
The greater world, beyond rat salad review, right? The vast masses who listen to Eddie Trunk and Howard Stern and
stop mentioning Eddie Trunk. You're not coming on the show ever again.
We have credibility. Our music tastes go past 1989.
who read Rolling Stone and whatever. I think if it came out that, there was some sort of acknowledgement that, Bon had contributed lyrics to Back in Black, I think it would change the way that people think about Bon Scott, as it should, because it's the second biggest selling album of all time.
Yep.
So as I said, it's about me respecting him as a human being and as an artist. It's not about me making money from it. I can assure you, I'm not making money from it anymore. I'm doing this because I care about it. I care about him as a person. And when you write a biography of someone and spend 4 years working on it,
right, and you got deeply,
you feel close to them,
right, yeah,
and you develop a personal connection to the idea of this person that you've put on the page.
yeah.
And that was the only thing that I was trying to do. I went out and sort of wrote that book because I was incredibly dissatisfied with everything that I'd read about Bon Scott. And I wanted to get to know him a bit better. And I went and worked on that book for a long time. You can't help but sort of feel sort of intimate with him.
Yeah.
What I like about your book is, well, there's a lot of things I like about your book. I like your writing in general. I read a lot, so I'm into literature. But besides that, I like the fact that Bon Scott comes off as a complex, likable person. He's not a character, he's a human being. And I also like the fact that you capture an era that is gone. And not just the music industry, just the lifestyle that revolved around him. He didn't live it in a vacuum, and you capture that in the book. But I think most importantly, what you get out of the book is you walk away liking the guy. You realize how human he is, because he is a mess. And that, I'm not saying that to put him down. I'm a fan of the man. But you walk away from the book liking him as a human being, realizing what a loss it is, not just as an artist, but just to people who actually knew and loved him. And but he comes off as a complex, likable, real person, not a character that I kind of grew up being around. You read the stories, you just read about him drinking. That was part of him, but there was more to him than that. And that's what I liked about your book.
Thank you. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to sort of portray him as a real human being, and that's why I get really annoyed with like the people who are like running Bonfest in Scotland. It's great that town has like this statue of Bon Scott, but the Bon Scott that they have in their mind is very different to the Bon Scott that you read about in my book. Yeah. I don't think it bears any kind of relation to that Bon Scott, and they're not interested in that Bon Scott. And they this is a Bon Scott festival that has absolutely no interest in my story about Bon at all. Right? They totally reject it because it goes against the idea that they have of Bon Scott. Right?
Right.
They can't get their heads around the fact that he died of a heroin overdose. Oh no, that doesn't sort of gel or marry with the idea we have. This is not the idea that we're going around and sort of commercializing, and it's not the idea that the Bon Scott estate is commercialized. And so, by writing that book, I've created, I guess, enemies in that sense. That they have their own idea about who he is, and I have my own idea. And all I want people to do, if you're somewhere in the middle, just read the fucking book and make up your own mind. Don't sort of necessarily go and believe what you read about online. All these people saying, that I'm a fucking scumbag mercenary writer who's just in it for the money, who's cashing in, who's got no interest in, Bon Scott as a human being. who's disrespecting the family, who fucking hates AC/DC. Do you even listen to AC/DC anyway? Fink, you cunt. I mean,
You obviously haven't read the book.
Yeah, I mean, if we honestly thought that you were a blue journalist, we wouldn't have even asked you on in the first place. And the fact that on your message board on Facebook, and somebody asked you right off the bat, you should look to speak out about this, and you immediately singled out us, Rat Salad Review. We're grateful that we made such a positive impression on you the first time around, that you wanted to come back around a second time to speak your piece. That's something that we don't take lightly. We're very grateful for that. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure, because you guys actually, one, you're good listeners. Two, you ask good questions, and three, you kind of know the subject. So it's good for me to talk with people who, have some grounding in the basics of the story, and that you can ask pertinent, intelligent questions about the subject. So there's nothing more frustrating to an author, sort of working in this sphere of sort of music books or AC/DC, when, you talk to an interviewer who knows absolutely nothing about AC/DC, and so their knowledge of AC/DC comes from watching behind the music, documentaries or whatever, or that shit you see on YouTube. I mean, these fucking crap documentaries about AC/DC, or these little clips that sort of appear every week. I mean, they're just complete fucking garbage.
Yeah, there's tons of that garbage out there.
I'm always surprised. In Australia, you usually pronounce AC/DC as Akadaka, but you don't. Why?
Well, that's a good question.
That is a very good question, Wayne.
That is an
Holy
excellent
crap.
question.
Oh, I'm a snob. I don't know. Akadaka.
Yeah, I don't like. I don't call it Akadaka, but I'm not
I
Australian.
don't get it.
To be honest with you, I think that's a bit of a myth too. I mean, I think Australians call AC/DC, but maybe in the 70s, 80s, Akadaka had a bit more sort of prevalence as a term, but I don't really hear that much really now.
Yeah. Like, it was funny because I was watching, Conan O'Brien, right?
Yeah.
He went to Australia, and then they somehow brought up AC/DC, and then somebody did say Akadaka, and then we had another guy that was from another band that came on our show, was from Australia, and he calls him Akadaka too. So just finding that interesting.
Yeah, but Eddie Trunk doesn't, so it's AC/DC.
Yeah, so that's the only thing that matters.
Well, he's the authority, man.
Oh my god, fuck Eddie Trunk. I'm sorry. But in Canada they call Rush's song YYZ YYZ. So
Americans think we have kangaroos, hopping down the middle of Sydney. It just.
Well, now you've ruined my trip to Sydney. Thank you, Jesse. That's what I was looking forward to.
But he does have a big spider.
Every day at 9, they all turn and face the west and blow a few notes on their didgeridoos.
That would be cool, actually.
Dingoes ate my baby. There, I said it. Okay, I'm sorry. Never mind.
Well, I'm gonna take off, but Jesse, thank you for apologize if I dominated the questions, but thank you for talking to me and talking to all of us. So it's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
So thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Manny. And one last thing, that on AC/DC, unrelated, but in 2017, you wrote a book about an Indian, the only Indian that was killed by the Nazis. And then you posted that book on your blog because you couldn't get anybody to print it or whatever. And then somebody else took that book. So did anything ever come of that? Did you ever get that guy to, away from that or whatever?
Yeah. And the funny thing was, my father said, you're running a bit of a risk, someone sort of pinching that, by putting it on your blog. And as said, I tried to get that up as a book, and it would have been a fascinating book to write. And this guy, Indian, was shot by the Nazis in Paris. It was the only Indian executed by the Nazis. And then, I find some other writer has sort of, put it on his Facebook as if it's something that he sort of came up with and researched himself. And it's shocking, but that's what happens with social media. But I did confront this guy, and I wrote to him and said, "What the fuck are you doing, pal?
Yeah.
Where do you get off doing that?" And actually someone had sort of written to me and sort of said this person had particular form in that area. And so, it wasn't just me, but he took it down. I think he was highly embarrassed by the whole thing. And I sort of certainly made it clear that, it was my work.
Yeah,
So
not a cool thing to do. All right,
that's what happens with social media. And
oh yeah, definitely. But I'm glad to hear now that he finally took it down and realized that's not the right thing to do. So.
It's not the first time this has happened to me. And, that's just the nature of sort of being in this business is that, there are some very unscrupulous people. So.
Oh yeah, definitely. What other bands do you like besides AC/DC, or at least the Bon Scott era of AC/DC?
I'm glad you asked.
Yeah. Always wondering.
I love, to be honest, Michael McDonald and the Doobie Brothers. I think they're fantastic. I am a hardcore Doobies fan. I love Steely Dan.
Me too.
Baxter.
Oh yeah.
Great guitar player.
I look, I literally, I think I've said this to you before, Wayne. I've got about as many CDs as you have. I listen to so much music, when I'm back in Australia. But I would say that Steely Dan and Doobies, that's that kind of, what would you call it? AOR West Coast sort of smooth rock sound.
Yep.
That's probably my favorite sort of genre of music.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I was always wondering. I figured when we got you on the show, we would find that out. So that's cool.
Well, I did try to write an Andy Gibb biography, actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because he has an amazing story.
Yep.
A very tragic story. Sort of not dissimilar to Bon Scott, actually, but obviously in a totally different genre of music. But he died very young and broke, and had terrible problems with drugs, and it would have actually been a great book. So I went down to Miami. I met Stephen Gibb, who was the son of Barry, and we sort of talked about the possibility of getting it up as a book and approaching Barry, and then Stephen was very supportive of it, and but he said that there was a Bee Gees movie coming out and it might sort of interfere with the movie. So I ended up sort of like I had with the Indian Nazi story. I put it up on my website, the proposal essentially for the Andy Gibb book. And then I got contacted by Andy's daughter and Spencer Gibb, the son of, who was it, Robin? Is it Robin? Yeah. And who said, thank you for doing that. Thank you for sort of acknowledging Andy Gibb. And I think a book has actually come out about Andy Gibb recently. So someone was already working on something. So, but, I'm always looking for, different sort of projects. I'm not sort of ruling out ever doing a music biography again. One of the books that I really wanted to do was a book called Capricorn, which is about Capricorn Records down in Georgia. I don't know if you guys know Capricorn.
No,
Can't say I'm familiar with it.
Yeah.
Okay, so these guys, the Waldens, were a bunch of brothers who started this record company called Capricorn, who handled Leonard Skinner, Allman Brothers. They managed Otis Redding. There were these white guys who kind of were sort of working with black artists before it was fashionable, and sort of ended up sort of becoming sort of the biggest little independent record company in America in the 70s. And it all sort of came crashing to a sort of fiery end at the end of the 70s. But it was just like a Boogie Nights sort of story, with some of the best music that you will ever hear.
Right.
And if you go and look at sort of, you know, the music that Capricorn Records put out in the 70s, it's pretty fucking amazing. I mean, like,
Yeah, never heard of it.
no, go and Google these
I'm
guys.
looking it up right now.
Alan Walden and Phil Walden, and they ran this amazing record company, and that was a book that I was very keen on doing, and I just couldn't get my agent in New York at the time to sort of take it on. He just didn't think that it was commercial enough, and I've always looked at that story and I've thought, fuck, that would just be an amazing Matthew McConaughey movie.
Actually,
Yeah.
some Australian television personalities that I've always been a fan of, or at least I've always appreciated them. Molly Meldrum of Countdown, who I thought was a great interviewer, and I've always found Norman Gunston to be very funny. There's a great interview, Wayne and Greg, that Kiss did in 1980 when they went to Australia with Eric Carr, where Norman Gunston, who's a character portrayed by this comedian, who's just asking them like a series of funny questions, and Kiss is just having fun right back with him. It's very funny. But yeah, Molly Meldrum, I guess you could call him like the Dick Clark or the Casey Kasem of Australia. Countdown was on the air for so many years. And there's some great clips on YouTube where they've actually interviewed Bond, or they've interviewed God knows how many people. I've always appreciated those talents. Ever thought about maybe, and again, not to pigeonhole you as a music writer, but you know, is like the history of arts and entertainment on television in Australia ever something that interests you?
Well, you know, I'm sort of in a catch-22. It's like I'm an Australian writer, but I'm trying to bring books to the world, right? My career
Understood.
relies on kind of writing books that I feel like that people in America are going to want to read, or people in Britain are going to want to read, or people in Germany or Italy or France. And so if you're looking at the pool of Australian biographies that you can write, they're very limited in that sense. And of course, I have an Australian publisher. My Australian publisher is interested in Australian subjects that they can sell in Australia, which of course is my primary market as an Australian writer, but I also want to have books that I can export.
Understood.
So Bon Scott is great in that sense, because he has international recognition. You know, people in America are interested in Bon Scott. People are interested in the Bee Gees. People are interested in Olivia Newton-John. But then if you look at Australian artists and Australian personalities that have that sort of international pull, there aren't a lot of them, and most of them have had books written about them already, like Michael Hutchence, for instance. So, you know, there's been, I think, half a dozen books written about Michael Hutchence, and I get people coming to me all the time saying, "Why don't you write a book about Michael Hutchence?" Well, you know, what can I offer that's new? Right. You know, I could do it. I could do another Bond: The Last Highway. Yeah, of course. But I also don't have the same passion or feel like I have the same sort of personal connection to him that I did with Bond. And getting back to, you know, what I said at the beginning of this interview, it's like I only got into this whole AC/DC thing because I literally felt like the Power Age album saved my life one night. That's how it all started.
I completely understand that. And I understand that, you know, speaking specifically about one subject is a very niche market. I just happen to be one of those people who appreciates niche books like that. I mean, I've kind of myself would like to either do a documentary or write something about the New York City music scene, everything from CBGB to Roseland, like all the clubs that have come and gone. But then I have to ask myself, I'm like, would I be the only one interested in a book like this or something like that? Or, would other people be interested in that? I don't know. I get what you mean by, you're an Australian writer who wants to contribute something on an international level as opposed to.
And I have to make money.
Absolutely.
So that's the thing with nonfiction. It's not like sort of sitting down and sort of just banging out a novel in 6 months that you just make up off the top of your head. You've got to go and research these things. And so, you look at Bond the Last Highway, there's about 100 pages of bibliography and notes. It's because it's heavily researched, and that takes time. You can spend a day working on one footnote. So, this idea that I'm cashing in from these books is just ridiculous, because it just takes such a long time, and I'm not really getting paid for those books beyond the advance that I'm getting, which is paid in thirds. So you get a little bit when you start the book, you get a little bit when you finish the book, and then you get a little bit, when the book is published, and you've got to survive on that money. So that means that when you do decide that you're going to spend 2 to 4 years working on a book, you want to write a book that has some promise of actually sort of delivering you an income, because I can assure you that I don't do this for the money. I do it because I love it, and I'm trying to survive as a writer, because it's what I do best. But if I was really about the money, I'd be working in PR or advertising or radio, doing countless other things other than writing books. I write books because I love what I do, and honestly, I just wanted to kind of contribute something to the world before I die. That's it.
Well, let's hope that's not for a very, very long time. So,
yeah.
Yeah, we hope so. Hope we get and at least have you back on the show again for another book that you do. But where can people go to find about your books and everything else that you're doing?
Well, jessefinkbooks.com is my website, and social media wise, I'm not really sort of doing much at the moment. I probably post more on Twitter than anything else sort of recently. I'm sort of a bit of a ghost on sort of Facebook and Instagram, but when the next book comes out, I'll sort of obviously be promoting that book. That's about spies. So it's like a completely different subject altogether. But, like these days, I kind of mostly use social media just to, promote
the
books. And otherwise, I sort of have a very sort of private life. So
it's the way to be.
I think so. I think it's a healthy thing.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Bon Scott the Facebook group. Just mention that. What's the name of that in case anyone wants to go?
Forum. Well, that I do post regularly on that. So if anyone is interested in Bon Scott talking about Back in Black and the death and everything else, Bon Scott Forum in groups is where to go. We've got about 15,000 members, and we're constantly kind of posting about things that people want to talk about and that you can't talk about anywhere else. And that's actually why we started the group, is that we couldn't talk about these things anywhere else. So we found we created a great sort of community of people who are pretty passionate about talking about these things, and ultimately, I just hope that by continuing to talk about these things, we get a little bit closer to the truth.
Yeah.
That's all I want.
Yep, and I think that's what all the fans want. So everybody, please go join that group and go check out Jesse's websites. And just to let everybody know, this will be our last episode for a while. We need a break. Well, actually, last week was supposed to be our episode, but since Jesse called me out and called Rat Salad Review out, we had to have our last show with Jesse. So I'm glad we had the last show with you, Jesse.
Yeah, it's very rare where we respond to a call out. We're not rappers, so thank you for this.
Thanks, guys.
But it won't be. We won't be gone forever. We'll be back. We'll come back at some point, hopefully before the end of the year, and do a year-end show and all that stuff. But we will be back, and we will see you guys then. And again, thank you guys very much for watching, and please hit that subscribe button. And again, thank you again, Jesse. What, Lou? What? Get it in,
guys. I'm happy to say our subscriber count went up to 863 tonight.
Really?
So thank you
Very
you to everyone who subscribed, and thank you to our guest, Mr. Jesse Fink. And on behalf of Greg, our excitement, we just found out that a new Corner album is getting recorded. So hopefully that'll be around next year for us to review.
That's right. And if we get to 1,000 subscribers, Lou is going to give the 1,000th subscriber, I guess, a CD that we were on, actually.
Yes, this Def Leppard tribute album, Let's Get Rocked. Wayne and I are track 12, where we cover the title track from their second album. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Their second album was High and Dry. The song is On Through the Night. That's the name of their first album, but the song itself is on their second album. And you'll get some great other covers on here, including Roxy Blue doing Let It Go, and former supposed Vinnie Vincent singer Jim Crean doing Def Leppard karaoke. But on top of that, no,
our song is real, so that's the only thing that matters on there.
It's a karaoke track of songs Def Leppard recorded. Like, I think he just put his vocals on it. But the cool thing about it, though, is that original Def Leppard drummer Tony Koenig is on 2 of the tracks on this CD. So I promise your copy will be autographed.
Yeah, so please make sure you hit that subscribe button, and also we'll be releasing an interview with the drummer Matt Thompson from King Diamond if we get to 1,000 subscribers. So make sure we hit that 1,000 subscribers, and that will be released. And we will see you guys very soon. Bye.
Support Severed Angel and Demoni.
Oh yeah, severedangel.bandcamp.com and projectresurrect.bandcamp.com, ratsailreview.com. Jesse
Linktree Music is Live podcast.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.